Hello, welcome to Akbar's Chamber. I'm your host, Nile Green'in, and in this episode we're going to be talking about the Dervish poets of medieval Turkey and how they allow us to think about the concept of vernacular Islam. While the Quran, of course, was revealed in Arabic, across most of the Muslim world, and for most of Muslim history, only a small minority of Muslims have actually been able to understand, let alone read, written Arabic. For this reason, over the past 1,000 years especially, a whole series of vernacular Muslim literatures developed. And in the earliest cases, many of these first Muslim writers of vernacular literatures, whether Turkish or Urdu, Malay or Bengali, were Sufis, otherwise known as dervishes or sometimes abdals. In this episode, we're going to be following the teachings and the poetry of one of the most influential of these medieval mystical dervishes. His name was Kaygus Abdal, and he lived between the late 14th and the mid 15th century in Anatolia, the region that's now Turkey. His Turkish poems, and we'll be hearing some of them in the Turkish original as well as in an English translation, brought the profound mystical doctrines of figures like Ibn al-Arabi, the great medieval Sufi master, to the ordinary peasants and tribespeople who lived across medieval Anatolia, and indeed by this period in the Balkan regions of southeastern Europe. Helping us to understand the life and times, the teachings and poems of Kaygus Abdal is Zeynep Oktay Uslu, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Turkish Language and Literature at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. She's the translator and editor of the Mesnevi Babı Kaygus, which was published by the Harvard University Department of Near Eastern Languages and Literatures in 2013. Hello Zeynep, welcome to Akbar's Chamber.
Hello Niall, thank you for having me.
Well, in this episode we're going to be travelling to the medieval period, a time of nomads and tribesmen, of Sufis and sultans. And we're going to be examining how elevated metaphysical ideas about who we are as humans and how we relate to our divine creator were communicated in vernacular poetry that ordinary people could understand. And we'll be looking especially at the role of wandering Sufis or dervishes as spiritual and moral teachers. And we'll be seeing in particular how a Turkish vernacular tradition of Islam took shape in the medieval centuries and then was passed down to survive and still flourish in the present day. And more generally, thematically, I suppose, we're going to be talking about how religion and language, particularly languages other than the Arabic of the Quran, became important vehicles of teaching among ordinary Muslims. So let me start off then, Zeynep, by asking you to explain what we might mean when we speak of a vernacular Islamic tradition.
The term vernacular is about language. To understand vernacular, we have to think about it in terms of its opposite, which is the word cosmopolitan. A vernacular language is, we can say, the native tongue, in contrast to the cosmopolitan, which is the language of learning. So vernacular is informal, immediate, and local. It is an everyday order of culture, and it develops in person-to-person interaction and is learned that way and is perpetuated that way. So when we're saying vernacular Islamic tradition, as you just mentioned, we're speaking about an Islamic tradition that takes place or takes shape in a language other than Arabic. And maybe we can add that Persian to that too, which becomes cosmopolitan its journey. And so, in addition to Turkish, we can think of languages like Tatar and Urdu. What happens here is that these languages, in becoming vernacular, are actually becoming written down. So an oral idiom and a spoken language takes as its model the cosmopolitan or the highly literate, high culture language, and creates its own written tradition based on that language. And that's what we call vernacularization. And of course, the vernacular Islamic tradition, together with that, comes with its own localized beliefs and customs and practices, and thus is closely related to quite certain current debates about the plurality of Islam, or are there several Islams, or can we think about the core of Islam and what would that be, and how removed would be from that when we are practicing Islam in another language.
Well, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because as you're suggesting already, we're talking about something that might seem in a way arcane or trivial, or academic language and cosmopolitan vernacular, but it actually brings us to really core questions about the nature of Islam, or as you said, Islams. Are there various Islams? And indeed, if there are, how do they come about? What role does language play in that? And indeed, what unites these different Islams? Is it, for example, in some sense, the Arabic script, or indeed a core set of ideas that are communicated through Arabic and perhaps trickle down, get translated, get reinterpreted through these different languages? Or maybe in a sense become other Islam through I guess a process of exchange, dialogue. I don't quite know what the word might be, with the existing perhaps cultural heritage of different peoples, whether peoples in medieval Turkey or Anatolia, what we're going to look at, or indeed in other places that you've mentioned, for example, with Urdu in the regions that are now India or Pakistan. So as our case study then, is we're going to move away from these kind of abstractions, aren't we? We're going to look at a particular case study of a language and poetry and people, and indeed mystical teachings in that language. As our case study, we're going to turn to medieval Anatolia, the region that we now call Turkey. And as we do that, perhaps you can set the scene for us of the time and the place where this particular Turkish vernacular Islamic tradition first took shape.
So Anatolia is actually a latecomer to the Islamic realm. It only became part of the Muslim world in the late 11th century. And while the conquest of Anatolia was swift, the Islamization of Anatolia was a very slow process. It wasn't until the 12th or the 13th century that we could see any sort of literary production or any sort of works in Arabic and Persian and any sort of Islamic landscape, such as mosques and other practices. So within this landscape, the urban centers became Islamized more quickly. But the moment you moved out from there, the rural areas remained largely Greek or Armenian or multicultural. And one aspect of that multiculturality was, of course, the Turkmens, the Turks who moved to Anatolia with the Seljuk conquest. Now, in the early 14th century, the Ilhanid power, the power of the Mongols on Anatolia, began to collapse, and it collapsed definitively in 1335. In this period, in place of this authority, rose small principalities. Princes, we can say, but who were more like magnates and warlords. And so the whole Anatolian landscape consisted of these small principalities. Now, the important thing about these principalities was that the princes were Turkish, and many of them didn't speak Arabic or Persian, and they came from nomadic origins. So because they acquired this new authority and this new political power, they needed some sort of legitimation, and that came through connection to the personal Islamic heritage. So what happened was there was a need to translate these written languages, the literary production and the scientific production in these languages into Turkish, first of all, for the education of the princes themselves, but also for their public and for their larger aim of Islam, of propagating Islam and their Turkic culture. That was one aspect of why Turkish started becoming written down. So we take Turkish, the earliest examples, the written examples of Turkish, we see in the early 14th century. And we think that perhaps the earliest example, specimen, might be Yunus Emre, the poetry of perhaps the most popular Turkish Sufi mystic of all time. So one reason, as I said, was this legitimation of this new power. Another reason was the Islamization of these rural populations, of these rural Turkish populations, which was related to Sufism. So, as in many places in the Islamic world, in Central Asia, for instance, a lot of these Turkmen tribes, their introduction to Islam was through these wandering dervishes or Sufis. And they also did not speak Arabic or Persian, and they did not have access to the written sources of Islam. So their access to Islam was through these charismatic, nomadic, religious leaders who for the literate urban Muslims looked a lot like tribal leaders, a lot more like tribal leaders than they did that they looked like scholars per se. And so that was another reason for these Sufis, on the other hand, to write in Turkish. And this is how a mode of Turkish emerged that we can call Old Anatolian Turkish, which was the earliest phase of the vernacularization of Turkish Anatolia. This period lasted until the rise of the Ottomans. As the Ottomans absorbed the other principalities before, in mid to late 15th century, little by little, they became not a beylik, not a principality, but an empire, which then led, of course, to Turkish becoming the language of an empire. And that process, of course, made Turkish, radically changed Turkish, we can say, because it had to become a language of instruction, a written language of its own proper tradition, on par with perhaps Arabic and Persian. So in this process, Turkish, the Old Anatolian Turkish, which had mostly Turkic words with very little Persian and Arabic, little by little became Arabized and Persianized. And when you come to the 16th century, you have this Turkish, which is considered still Turkish, but it's almost like a Creole language where you have the verbs which are in Turkish, which sometimes are the only indicators that the language itself, the verbs and the suffixes, and some of the suffixes, can be the only indicators that that language is Turkish. And so we can think of this as Turkish first becoming a vernacular and then becoming a cosmopolitan vernacular. So a vernacular which has all of the qualities of the cosmopolitan language which it imitates.
The Seljuks are formed in 1077 is the beginning of the Seljuks of Rum, and these particular early Muslim ruled Turkic states that are in this very, I suppose, diverse human landscape, isn't it, that had been the Byzantine Empire with these many Christian and indeed Armenian populations as well. Yes, but anyway, do go on.
Yeah, that is a great point. And to add to that, we can think of English in the same manner too, right? Because in late medieval Europe, the same situation is true for English as well, where it is becoming vernacular, rise. And we have all these authors who say, well, English is not adequate to express these highly literate discourses, and it's not adequate to become a language of literature and learning. And the authors who do write in those languages then have to prove that that language is adequate, the way Dante had to prove that Italian was adequate. And so so in English, we have maybe the most extraordinary example of a language becoming a vernacular and then moving from a vernacular to the world language, the cosmopolitan of our time.
What you've actually talked through there, Zeynep, is actually something that happens, of course, as you know better than I do, with so many other languages of the Islamic world, isn't it? That process by which spoken languages of low status gradually then start to model themselves, at least their literary expression, their written form, by taking the Arabic alphabet or an extended version of it, borrowing lots of vocabulary from Arabic and often borrowing particular genres from Arabic. And then suddenly these vernacular languages, these rustic languages become respectable. It happens first with Persian, doesn't it? And then in roughly the same time, it starts to happen with languages in Anatolia, Turkic languages, and also with languages in North India. And then a little bit later, it'll happen in Southeast Asia with languages like Malay or indeed what becomes called Jawi, Arabic script Malay. And this is something, again, that we see also, in a sense, happening in Europe at the same time, isn't it? This is the period when the Romance languages start to be written down after centuries or the best part of a millennium of the domination of Latin. And as you were talking, I was thinking actually of Dante, who's really contemporary with many of the figures you're looking at, a few hundred miles to the west. And of course, then we have written then in the Commedia, in the Divine Comedy, of course, the extraordinary work of extreme theological sophistication of Thomas Aquinas's theology in the kind of Romance language, the popular spoken Italian of Florence that ordinary people could understand. So when we're talking about Islam in Anatolia, but we're actually talking about a process, vernacularization. And as you said, a vernacular then becomes respectable language of state, a cosmopolitan language, the language of Italy, the language of the Ottoman Empire, the language of the Renaissance, the language of many great Ottoman sultans and poets. And this is a more general process. It's not unique to Islam, is it? But we are here to talk about Islam.
Yeah, that is a great point. And to add to that, we can think of English in the same manner too, right? Because in late medieval Europe, the same situation is true for English as well, where it is becoming vernacular, rise. And we have all these authors who say, well, English is not adequate to express these highly literate discourses, and it's not adequate to become a language of literature and learning. And the authors who do write in those languages then have to prove that language is adequate, the way Dante had to prove that Italian was adequate. And so in English, we have maybe the most extraordinary example of a language becoming a vernacular and then moving from a vernacular to the world language, the cosmopolitan of our time.
That's right, actually, yeah. I mean, I didn't want to be parochial and bring up English, but I also was, as well as Dante, there's me trying to be cosmopolitan, but as well as Dante, I was actually thinking of the vision of Piers the Plowman, which is from the bit of England that I'm from, in fact. And that, of course, is another sort of spiritual classic as well, which is in a much more kind of, rustic form of English, I guess, or much more vernacular form of English than Chaucer around the same time is importing from Italy, trying to bring in these more cosmopolitan kind of literary forms and rhymes. Yeah, but we've got to get back to Anatolia, I guess, and that's what's the exciting stuff we're talking about today. So let's look at a specific example then of a vernacular Islamic tradition, of a vernacular Turkic tradition in action. And let's look at the extraordinary, fascinating figure of the wandering dervish, the wandering Sufi, one of these kind of wandering teachers who are hanging out with tribesmen and others, as you've mentioned. And this is the Sufi, the dervish, Kaygusus Abdal. So can you tell us who was Kaygusus, what were his teachings, and moreover, how did he go about teaching them? Kaygusus
Abdal is a very interesting figure because he has an extraordinary legacy, a unique legacy, but was also eclipsed by subsequent authors and subsequent people in his tradition. So I have to, with Kaygısız Abdal, I have to start by translating his name. Kaygısız means, it's very vernacular, means carefree. So someone who doesn't have any cares. And then Abdal, the word Abdal, it started as a type of saint in the spiritual hierarchy of, but the term itself, but it changed over time to denote a type of dervish. So when we're talking about, so to start with Kaygısız Abdal, I want to give a little bit of a context about who the Abdals were and who dervishes were, because this is very interesting. So from maybe the late 12th century to up to the 15th century, we had this flourishing of these dervish groups in the Islamic realms, who were actually, if you think about their worldviews and their understandings of religion, were Sufis, but were very strict about not calling themselves that, because for them, the word Sufi denoted something that later became the word Sofu in Turkey, became Turkified into the word Sofu, which is someone who only understands the practical and the surface of religion, who doesn't have an internalized understanding of religiosity itself, which we would think would be the opposite of what maybe the Sufis saw themselves to be. But this comes from this political aspect of the institutionalization of Sufism, where Sufism gradually became tightly linked with political power and physical wealth, this worldly wealth. So it became this worldly. And this was a reactionary movement. And the Abdals of Rum, by the way, the word Rum means Anatolia, and it's very interesting because it also means Rome, Rome, and it's because of the Byzantine, right, past of Anatolia. And it shows you that Anatolia is a very late comer to the Islamic name, because it was still called Rome throughout until the end of the Republican period, until the beginning of the Republican period. Now, the Abdals of Rum, so the Anatolian Abdals, were one of these groups. And their defining characteristic was that they spoke Turkish, the Turkish vernacular, and some of them wrote in Turkish. Now, the most, I think, among all of the interesting qualities of Kaygısız Abdal, I would probably put forth the fact that he wrote, period. That he wrote, because these wandering dervishes, there were a lot of them, and they had all these rites that, these heresiographies speak like, very strongly about and protest their version of Islam, which they considered to be a diversion and an antinomianism. Now, he actually not only wrote poetry and prose works, but he was a prolific author. Now, our first question is, how is it possible in a completely oral environment? Because the Turkmen tribes that he was among, they didn't know how to read and write. So if he wrote, who did he write for? That is problematic. Now, some of the clues to answering this question actually lie in his legends, in his hagiography, because in his hagiography he is depicted as the son of a prince, not maybe the highest prince in the principality, but one of the princes. And on a side note, we think he lived late 14th to early 15th century. So that was still before the rise of the Ottomans, and
that's pretty striking, isn't it? The time period you're placing him in. I mean, in the 1300s to the mid 1400s or something, because this is a good century after the death of Rumi, the most famous of all Sufi poets, who had actually lived and been patronized in one of these Seljuk capital cities in Anatolia, in Konya, but had written in Persian, written in the cosmopolitan language, hadn't it? So it's really striking that even a century later then, that we have someone who is writing as well, but also in the vernacular.
Yes, that is very interesting. And another interesting aspect is, for instance, Rumi's son, Sultan Veled. You look at his divan, and it's in Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Greek. So we think that a lot of these people, during that period, Greek was a major spoken language, and maybe taking us back to those princes who needed Turkish to be written down, maybe they spoke Greek, but they didn't speak Arabic or Persian. So now what happens is, of course, that when we come to a figure like Kaygusuz, this is also an interesting point. And he wrote some of his poetry in Persian, but a very rudimentary Persian. And when we look at his work, we see that he actually modeled himself or his work on not the Arabic tradition, but the Persian tradition. So it is an instance also of Persian as cosmopolitan language. And little by little, of course, what he did was he took that tradition, which he also maybe some of it he acquired orally as well, not necessarily in written form. He took that tradition and he sort of merged it with the oral idiom. And he's not, of course, the only person to do this. The Yunus Emre, the earliest Sufi mystic and the most popular Sufi mystic of all time, the Turkish Sufi mystic, who actually was very fond of Rumi and who spoke highly of Rumi in his work, he also did this. He's the one who actually started this whole process of creating new genres that were sort of like a mixture between the learned and the highly literate models that they took and the oral idioms that they needed to use to communicate it with the people they were talking to. So they were sort of bridging the gap, I would say. And so another interesting aspect of Kaygusuz Abdal, of course, that he was a wandering dervish. Now, this whole dervish movement also was in stark contrast to institutionalized Sufism in that they did not form orders. They had affiliations. So they were affiliated with several people, different people, and they could move from lodge to lodge from different areas in the Islamic world. And Kaygusuz himself traveled extensively in the Balkans, and there are place names in the Balkans in his name to our day. And he also traveled in the Middle East all the way to Egypt, where he formed a lodge and most probably died there. And that his lodge there was active as a Bektashi lodge, as a lodge of the Bektashi order, one of the most prominent Turkish orders of the Ottomans, until this lodge was active until 1965.
When we say lodge, it's one of the conventions, isn't it, for us as scholars? And I wonder what ordinary people, our listeners, learners, they no doubt might make of that. And a lodge, we might imagine it as being, in some senses, the medieval Muslim Sufi equivalent of a monastery in some senses, because the Sufis too, as you've already hinted at, but by this time, by the medieval period, the Sufis were often, many of them, the institutionalized ones, as you said, were extremely wealthy. They had a lot of land holdings, like the medieval Christian monastic orders. They had their libraries, what we call their lodges, the places where they might live. The others might reside some of the time, others might visit. They had their pilgrimage centers, their tombs, their libraries, their mosques. Indeed, their employees working on the lands, and perhaps in many cases, large numbers of them. But as you said with Kaygusuz Abdal, he's one of the people that aren't doing that. In a sense, there's a bit like perhaps the Franciscans, isn't it, in some senses? But these are not organized or affiliated into an order, or the equivalent of a monastic order, or indeed a Sufi order. So he's one of these wandering figures there.
Yes, and interestingly, his groups, the Abdals, and the Bektashis, which he was also affiliated with, little by little also become institutionalized at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, of the Ottoman sultans, because these dervish groups, they're really hard to control. Once a Sufi group becomes an order, then they have order. So you can appoint people to them, and you can track their whereabouts, and you can track their financials, and you can use them for political and ideological purposes. And this is something that happened in Anatolia. So with the imperialization of the Ottomans, in hand, little by little, the Bektashis became affiliated with the Janissaries, and little by little, they also became an order per se. And all of these different groups, which included not only the Abdas, but Kalenderis and Jamis and Persian-speaking groups as well, they all sort of gradually were subsumed into the Bektashi order. Now, with Kaygusuz Abdal teachings, though, this is another unique aspect of him. Within this whole institutionalization, he still remains, in some aspect, sort of like a marginal figure. First of all, he is a marginal figure who is at the same time the founder of Alevi Bektashi literature. He's the first author who took this vernacularization, started out by Yunus Emre, and then with this transfer of idioms, transfer between idioms, created a unique idiom and created a unique language and terminology, which then and generic created unique generic conventions, which then lasted until our day. I will talk more about how it lasted, but now I want to start out with what the content of that was. First of all, because some of it, of course, because these were still dervish groups, not institutionalized, what this meant was that individuals had their own doctrines, and there was a lot of multiplicity. So you could have two individuals within the same dervish group with, in a sense, radically different understandings of Sufism and Islam. And you can see that with Kaygusuz. For example, another Abdal, Sadık Abdal, who comes up maybe 30, 40 years after him in the Balkans, who lived in the lodge of Sayyid Ali Sultan in the Balkans, which was a very important, again, Sufi center for the Bektashis and later Alevis. You compare them, and for Sadık Abdal, his whole divan is basically focused on the veneration of saints. So the veneration of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet, and the veneration of Hacı Bektaş, the so-called founder of the Bektashi order, the veneration of the 12 Imams, a little like starting out from this period. Of course, the Shiitization in relation to Shiism is a whole other topic that is difficult to get into. But Kaygusuz Abdal, on the other hand, saw himself as a saint and denied believing in a hierarchy of sainthood and any saint worship. So we have someone who is against saint worship who calls himself a saint. This, of course, is the biggest paradox, I think. Some of his teachings, I would say, are quite radical, like this one. For instance, the reason why he didn't want saint worship is he believed, first of all, that in a completely egalitarian society, so each one of us is a saint, and we become a saint the moment we realize that we're already a saint, that we've always been saints. And how do we come to this realization? We come to this realization by remembering the pact between us and God mentioned in the Quran, in the Surah of Araf, where God asks the servants, "Am I not Lord your Lord?" And the servant says, "Yes, we attest." So,
and the servants are all of the souls of humans that will ever be created, aren't they? And alastu bi rabbika, am I not your Lord? And all humans bow down and say yes. Well, and of course, Satan doesn't. But that's another story.
Yes. So, according to Kaygusus, the whole world is this one moment, the actual truth of the truth, which is, the word haq, is perhaps the central part of his doctrine. The truth, which is invisible to the layperson, to the person who is not initiated into Sufism, the person who has not gained saintly status, or at least has not recognized any saints. For this person, the truth is inaccessible. But once it becomes accessible, you see that all beings are still in that moment of saying yes to "Am I not your Lord?" And that is their eternal abode, which they have never left. Now, once we put this out there, the conclusion is that, well, how do you believe in heaven and hell if you've never departed from heaven? And this, of course, takes us to a sort of a cyclical understanding of time, where the hierarchy, so as an individual moves up the spiritual path towards perfection, they come back to where they started. And that is the whole purpose of the spiritual path for Kaygusus Zapta. So I have a few poems, actually, that I would like to read to you to express this. And of course, I didn't say, but I did say he was prolific. He wrote several mesnawis, which are long narrative poems. And he wrote prose works. He wrote works which alternate between prose and poetry. And he had a divan, which has a very important historical significance as well, because it is perhaps the earliest place we see the veneration of the 12 imams in the Turkmen context, which then sort of also calls us to modify our timeline for the entrance of Shiite doctrines into this realm. And he has this one work called Kitab-ı Maklata, the Book of Prattle, where he pretends to speak rubbish for those who don't understand it, who don't understand what he's saying. And that whole work is about self-identification with Ali. So that is as extremist as he gets. I would say he has a spectrum of teachings that take, on one hand, he has poems where he talks about the importance of fasting and daily prayer, though very few. And then on the other hand, he has the divinization of Ali. And I personally have theorized this in a way that takes the audience as its center. So if he has this multiplicity of teachings, the logical conclusion is he was speaking to different people according to their own spiritual ranks. And that is why we have this multiplicity.
And so you're giving us the sense then that, I mean, spectrum is a word you've used. He has a really broad spectrum, doesn't he? He's evidently literate, or his works are being written down, and they're constructed and artful, aren't they? I mean, as you said, he composes a Masnavi, and Rumi's great masterwork, of course, is the Masnavi, isn't it? Which was famously called by the later Sufi Jami, the Quran in the Persian tongue. It's a formal, constructed type of literary text. And then, as you've said, he has the Book of Prattle, these kind of poems that are, I suppose, perhaps a sort of a hyper vernacular form. But we're also getting the sense from what you've explained with his interpretation of the day of Am I Not, or the day Am I Not Your Lord, from the Surah Al-Arafah in the Quran, that there's an engagement with the Quranic text, there's an engagement with the revelation, but there's an interpretation of it, isn't there? And as you said, because he's not part of a hierarchy that he has to say, this is the orthodox line I must follow. He's working in a creative theological engagement of some of the actual profound existential implications of what that Quranic text is, without having to think, oh, that's already been decided by some more senior mullah or some figure in a Sufi or other hierarchy. And he's explaining all of this complex stuff through the poems that you're going to give us some examples of now.
Yes, and interestingly, a big debate is how much of this was Islam. Were these authors Muslims, or were these Turkic tribal leaders representatives of Islam? And what he says is, this is the truth of Islam. This is his perspective is, what I'm saying is the truth of Islam, because I have direct access to the truth of Islam, and I don't need any mediator for this direct access, which is why he also denies saint worship. And he not only says, I don't need any mediator, but none of you need mediators. So the way I have access to God, you also have access to God. You have access to not only God's attributes, not the forms of creation, not the attributes, but God's essence. And that is something that is very unique in a sense too. And of course, this whole theoretization is based on, in a sense, the school of Ibn Arabi. So the Wujudi school, the what we call the oneness of being, where all being is united and emanates from God and is a mirror image of God. But he also then takes this, again, highly literate discourse and makes it his own and makes his unique interpretation of it, which in hindsight, some of it, I'm sure Ibn Arabi would himself not approve.
So Ibn Arabi is sometimes called the Sheikh al-Akbar, isn't it? The greatest of masters, this Andalusian Sufi master from medieval Spain, 1165 to 1240, and he is the great theorist, isn't he, of Sufism, and indeed in many ways of Islam altogether. But I was just thinking, I mean, before we dive in deeply into the poems, I was really struck by what you're saying, Zeynep, because it really gives a sense that, because by the time in which Kaygus Abdal is living, there is this saint worship, saint veneration, just as in medieval Catholicism, in medieval Islam, there are many saints, many shrines, many pilgrimages, and these are the Sufi masters. Rumi, by this period, is one of these saints that might well be worshipped, perhaps one of the very figures that Kaygus has in mind. Don't go to his tomb, don't bow there, because Kaygus is saying he can bring you directly to Haqq, the truth, which of course is one of the 99 names of God in Islam. So I'm really fascinated by this, because he's at once in some senses a Sufi, but he's an anti-Sufi, at least in terms of what Sufism has become in that period. He's a popularist, he's a vernacular figure. But on the other hand, his teachings are really, as you were saying, at the core of Ibn Arabi's highly technical Arabic discourse, and indeed some of the core lessons of the Quran, that there are no mediators between humankind and God. It's extraordinary, yeah, and that he's doing in this vernacular poetry.
Okay, let's start with number one. I'm reading the Turkish first. I am reading it in modern Turkish pronunciation, because I don't know how to pronounce 14th century Old Anatolian Turkish. So you'll have to bear with me on that. Evveli ahir her ne ki var pergal içinde bir noktadur ancak. Pes hafu reca zühtü taat kitabu peygam deftaru berat ne. Berat ne. So from the first to the last, all that exists in the universe is nothing but a dot. So what are fear and hope, asceticism and worship, the book and the message, the notebook and the warrant?
Fascinating. And this is, again, it's very literary, isn't it? The metaphor about the dot is presumably the dot of a pen, isn't it, that makes the ink dot. The nukta, did you say? So these metaphors are actually a written language in a sense.
Yes, and also it could mean the saying attributed to Ali, I am the dot beneath the bag, which is the Basmala, which is the first word of the Quran. So the essence of the essence of the essence, so to speak. Okay, so another one about Okay. So now another interesting example here is kaygısız speaking through the mouth of God in a type of shatr, which is again taken from Arabic literature, where the godhood takes over, let's say, in the man, and the speaker is no longer the kaygısız or the saint in question, but God himself. So this is what he said. Canım hakikat veli ki candan münezzehem. Namu nişandan münezzehem. Benim vasfım beyan olmaz. Bana namu nişan olmaz. Bana kimesine can olmaz. Veli ben cümleye canım. Ne odum ben ne yil oldum. Ne canu aklı dil oldum. Ne ağabam ben ne kil oldum. Ben o sırram ki pinhanam. Of course, for speakers of Arabic and Persian, you can hear all those Arabic and Persian words, which makes it even more interesting. My soul is the truth, but I am free of the soul. I am names and signs. I am free of name and sign. My qualities cannot be expressed. No name or sign can point to me. No one can be a soul to me, but I am the soul of all. I am neither fire nor air. I have not become soul, intellect, or heart. I am neither water nor earth. I am that hidden secret. So he has a lot of poems where he speaks as God, and this is actually taken up extensively by his followers, and it is still so the shatr, after it dies down in the Arabic realm, lives on in Turkish up to our day, where it is still, this type of speech is still part of not only Alevi poetry, which is sung during ritual, but also part of folk songs, which have sort of moved from there all the way to the oral idiom.
This is really extraordinary, isn't it? Because this shatr that you're talking about, the early most famous exponent was Abu Yazid or Bayezid Bastami, who's from the middle of what's now Iran, dies in 875, if I remember correctly. And he has many of these shatr, these ecstatic utterances that are in a sense a post-Quranic revelation. I don't think anybody's really claiming they're the same status of the Quran, but they are meant to be divine revelation, aren't they? And that's really fascinating, as you say, that after they fade out in the Arabic tradition, they're still really prominent and alive and well in Turkish. So tell us some more.
So an example of the pre-eternal pact and eternal paradise. So paradise or afterlife being pre-eternity. Cihanda henüz yok idi Mansur. We'll get to that after shatr. This is a good poem to continue with. Cihanda henüz yok idi Mansur. Tesbihüm idi demi enel hak. Genci ezelün haznesi gönlümde bulundu. Genç saklama hazne-i viraneyem yine. Ezel can iken vatanın meyhane genciydi. Bugün de hakim uşrindi meyhaneyem yine. When Mansur did not exist in the world, the moment of I am God was my litany. The storehouse for the pre-eternal treasure was found in my heart. Again, I am a ruined storehouse to hide the secret treasure. In pre-eternity, when I was the soul, my homeland was the treasure of the tavern. Again, today, I am a drunkard in the tavern. Of course, this tavern, again, this is taken from the Persian discourse, right? The Persian literary discourse on the wine and tavern and divine love, used with these tropes, which an important proponent in the Anatolian context was Rumi himself. And for Mansur, of course, who's the most famous person to utter the shatahat, and I am God and al-Haq, which he most likely did not say, it became, in the Anatolian realm, one of the most typical aspects of each Alevi Bektashi poem. So it's lived on, and the word, and Alevis today, they name their children Mansur. Now, after all these doctrinal poems, I want to give you a glimpse of how he thought people, urban people, literate people, urban Sufis and scholars viewed him. Scholars, Sufis, and urban ascetics. So people he considered could not understand the essence of Islam, but could only practice the outward observance of it, who in that sense, he's thought to be hypocrite. So his whole social discourse is focused on hypocrisy. So ne sünneti bilir, ne kat'a, ne farzı, ne delil bilir, ne ayet demişler. They say he knows neither the sunnah nor the fard. He has absolutely no knowledge of any proof or verse. Daim esrar yiyir, kırkar sakalın. Görün bu dehri bid'at demişler. They say he constantly eats hemp. He cuts off his beard. See this materialist innovator. So basically he is consciously not abiding by the sunnah, and not abiding by the sunnah is a political position, which does not make him less Muslim, or in fact, by the very truthfulness of it, by its very opposition to hypocrisy, becomes the truth of Islam.
Hypocrisy, of course, being one of the opposition to hypocrisy being one of the key moral themes of the Quran, isn't it? So this is one of the, again, extraordinary subtle dimensions, I think, of a poem like this. That he's saying, well, I'm not following what people are saying should be the outward teachings of the Quran, the Sunnah, etc. But in doing so, he's actually following then the spirit of the Quran by not indulging in hypocrisy.
Yes, and he says something very similar to this. He says, kaygısız abdalı her kim ki gördü, muhibbü Ahmedi Haydar demişler. Whoever sees kaygısız abdal says, this is a lover of Muhammad and Ali. İnkar ettiğini ikrara gelmiş, veli ikrarına inkar demişler. He has come to earth to avow what he had denied, yet they have mistaken his avowal for denial. So, this is this idea of the face of religion not being the same as its internal meaning. So this discrepancy between the face of religion and the meaning of religion. And for him, the face of religion doesn't count for anything. The meaning is all that exists, right? So, and he sees the other. So he sees the urban Sufi as the complete opposite, where religion has become the face of religion and the meaning isn't there. So, and because of this radical difference, his avowal looks like denial, and the denial of the others look like avowal. And all you can do, the only way you can understand, the only way you can identify truth then, is to access truth in your own heart, in your own faculty of love, which will give you direct access to God, hence giving you direct access to the truth itself. Then, of course, this relates him to the doctrine of love, which was founded by it has a long past, but important figures are starting with Ahmed Ghazali, and another important figure would be Rumi himself, who was the most famous proponent of the doctrine of love. And he's again continuing that whole tradition that he takes from Yunus Emre himself.
So, as you've said, the poetry of Kaygısız Abdal is still very widely read today. It's very alive, it's alive, well recited, and extremely important. And among the people who still keep Kaygısız Abdal's teachings and poetry alive are a group of people called the Alevis. Now, the Alevis are followers of, we might say, an Islamic tradition. They're the precise, let's say, parameters of their relationship to Islam is contested by Muslims, and indeed by the Alevis themselves. But they constitute around 15 to 20% of the population of Turkey, and their religious tradition is evidently a rich and important one within the Middle Eastern context. So, since they're keeping alive the tradition and the teachings of Kaygısız to this day, can you perhaps tell us then what is the legacy of this vernacular Islam, the legacy of Kaygısız Abdal, and indeed its relationship with Alevism today, both in Turkey itself and indeed with the larger Turkish and Kurdish diaspora?
This legacy is, in a sense, the legacy of the plurality of Islam, the plurality of Anatolia, not just in the Anatolian context, but also we can think of this in the larger context of Islam, modern Islam as being standardized and the fundamentalist perspectives, or the literalist perspectives, or taking us to our earlier discussion, the formal perspectives of Islam, the face of Islam, taking on greater value. And so this is, together with modernity, of course, the plurality of Islam in much of the Islamic world was also lost. So, and of course, this is very much related to the fall, the decline of Sufism too, right? So we have this tradition here in a country where Sufism was completely abolished by the state, where wherever lived as an underground movement actually became something other than medieval Sufism, became a lot closer to literalist understandings of Islam and more like secret movements. And within this whole context, the Alevis, who definitely do not think of themselves as Sufis, became the only actual vibrant area in modern Turkey where Sufism as spirituality in action, Sufism as the meaning taking precedence, is still alive. So it is the one. I would say it is not. So Alevism, in a sense, represents and Alevis, both Kurdish and Turkish Alevis, represent this idea of an Islam which can be both universal and local at the same time, can be both vernacular and cosmopolitan at the same time, without losing anything of itself, without losing anything of its essence. And Islam, which is not the Islam of just the Sunnah and the Quran. An Islam which is not the Islam of just the scholars, but of the common people, of the way they lived and practiced.
You've taken us through so many of the implications and the really profound possibilities of how we might use the writings of a medieval wandering dervish to address some of the key issues that shape Islam, its importance in Turkey, and indeed what Islam and Islams might be in the medieval world as much as today. Zeynep Ortaçağ, thank you so much for talking to us in Akbar's Chamber.
Thank you very much. This was a great pleasure.
Da